The winter in the valley was unforgiving, its icy grip tightening around the land like the hand of a vengeful ghost. A gray, steel-colored sky hung low, threatening to crack open with the weight of the storm that seemed to always be just around the corner. The ground, hardened by frost and snow, crunched beneath the hooves of Asher Boone's horse as he rode slowly along the frozen river, his breath clouding in the cold air. Asher was a man alone in a world that was as harsh and unforgiving as the land itself. His cabin, little more than a weather-beaten structure tucked away at the edge of the river, was his only companion. The cabin was small but sturdy, much like the man who lived in it. Inside, a fire burned in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the worn walls. The smell of damp wood and smoke lingered in the air. This place, this lonely corner of the world, was where Asher found his peace. There was no family here, no bustling towns or neighbors. Just the land, the livestock, and the constant hum of labor. Every day was the same. Rise before dawn, tend to the cattle, chop wood, mend fences. The work was never done, but neither was the solitude. The silence of the land matched the silence in his heart, a silence that spoke more of pain than comfort. The questions that had brought Asher to this life were simple, though no less heavy. What had driven him to choose this remote corner of the world, far from the rest of mankind? The answer, as it often is in these parts, was in the past. The war, the bloodshed, the death of his younger brother. All those things had shaped Asher into the man he had become. A man who preferred the company of cattle to people, the quiet of the mountains to the bustle of a town. His brother Samuel had died in an ambush while they were on a scouting mission. A bullet meant for Asher finding its mark on Samuel instead. Asher had held him in his arms as the life drained from his body, the cold desert wind carrying away his last breath. Afterward, Asher had tried to return to the life they had once shared, but the world had become a different place. Samuel's absence was like a hole in the ground, and Asher had never been able to fill it. He had returned home from the war a changed man, but nothing could change the fact that Samuel was gone. And so he came here, to this land where no one knew him and no one could ask him questions about his past. Here he could be the man he was now, a man shaped by grief and guilt, but at least he was alone. And in a way, that was the only peace he could find. But the quiet of the valley would not last forever. As the days grew longer and the seasons changed, Asher's life would begin to shift, though he would not know it at the time. Change comes slowly in these parts, creeping like a shadow, but when it does come, it doesn't ask for permission. And for Asher, the change would come in the form of a woman. But that story, well, that would take some time to unfold. The cold was biting that day, sharper than the usual winter chill in the valley. Asher Boone, bundled up in layers of worn clothing, rode out before dawn with a mission that didn't require much thought. He was heading to the Apache camp to deliver a small bundle of herbs and medicine, nothing more. The journey wasn't new to him. It was a routine that kept him from the silence of his cabin, a kind of escape that didn't ask much of him. The snow crunched beneath his horse's hooves and the pines swayed, their branches heavy with ice. The world was muffled, the only sound the wind cutting through the trees and the occasional distant howl of coyotes. Asher had long since gotten used to the desolation of the land. His world had been shaped by solitude, his every move made in rhythm with the harshness of the wilderness. He didn't expect anything unexpected. The land had never given him surprises, not until this day. He was passing through a small stand of trees when he heard it. A faint cry, distant but desperate, carried on the wind. Asher pulled the reins of his horse sharply, his boots digging into the snow to slow the animal. He turned his head, squinting through the bare branches in the frosty air. There it was again, a shout, this time clearer. It was a voice tinged with pain. Without a second thought, Asher dismounted, tying his horse loosely to a nearby tree. His hand instinctively went to the rifle on his back, but his feet moved swiftly toward the source of the cry. His instincts, honed by years of living on the edge of the wilderness, told him to be cautious. But something in that voice, something in the urgency, compelled him to move faster. He pushed through the dense underbrush, the cold biting his face until he reached the clearing. There, at the center of the small Apache camp, was the figure he'd been searching for. A man lying on the ground, blood staining the snow beneath him. The Apache Chief. Asher froze for a moment, his breath catching in his chest. The chief's men moved frantically around him, their faces tight with fear and worry, but no one was stepping forward to help. No healer was nearby. The chief's wound, an ugly gunshot to the side, was bleeding freely, and his chest heaved with every breath, each one more labored than the last. The warriors were watching Asher, their eyes wary and cautious, but they did not move to stop him. Asher didn't hesitate. He had seen death before, in every shape and form. He had learned the art of life-saving in the brutality of war, and in that moment, all of that training kicked in. He knelt beside the chief without a word, his hands moving quickly and efficiently as he began to work. The men and women of the camp looked on in silence, their faces a mixture of disbelief and hope. They didn't trust easily. The Apache people were a proud people, and they didn't take kindly to outsiders, least of all a man who bore the scars of the very conflict that had ravaged their lands. But in the heat of battle, survival often required sacrifices. Asher had proven himself worthy of this one. He tore the chief's shirt away, exposing the blood-soaked wound. Asher worked quickly, his hands steady despite the pressure mounting on his chest. He knew what was at stake. If the chief died, the tribe would be thrown into chaos. They would have no leader, and if he didn't do something now, it would be too late. Hours passed, but it felt like minutes. Asher stayed by the chief's side, his hands soaked in blood as he carefully stitched up the wound and packed it with herbs. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The language of survival was universal, and in that moment, it was the only thing that mattered. When he finished, the camp was eerily quiet. The chief's breathing had steadied, and his color had returned to a healthier hue, though he was still unconscious. Asher wiped his brow, his fingers numb from the cold. He stood looking around at the gathered Apache, each of them watching him intently. The sun had begun to set by the time the chief regained consciousness. He looked up at Asher with hazy eyes, his face gaunt and drawn. But there was a gleam of gratitude in those eyes, a silent understanding that passed between them. The chief struggled to sit up, wincing in pain as his warriors helped him into an upright position. His voice was hoarse, but strong enough to be heard. "You saved my life," the chief said, his words heavy with both respect and a certain weight of responsibility. His eyes met Asher's, steady and unwavering. "For this, you have earned my respect." He paused, then gestured toward his daughters, who had gathered quietly behind him. "Choose one of my daughters as your reward. She will go with you and serve you in whatever way you desire." Asher stood still, the weight of the offer settling over him like a cloud. He didn't want any reward. He wasn't here to take anything from these people, especially not something as sacred as one of their daughters. He shook his head, his expression firm and resolute. "No," he said, his voice quiet but sure. "I don't need anything. I did what I had to, that's all." The chief regarded him for a long moment, as if weighing Asher's words carefully. The men around them murmured quietly, unsure how to react. Asher could feel their eyes on him, skeptical, questioning, but not hostile. The chief's gaze shifted toward his daughters, and for a brief moment, his eyes lingered on one in particular. Sahoya. She was standing at the back of the group, her posture straight, her face unreadable. Asher's eyes met hers, and for just a fleeting second, there was a shift, a subtle, unspoken understanding between them. She wasn't like the others. She was different, stronger maybe, or perhaps just more determined. Her eyes didn't hold fear or uncertainty. Instead, they seemed to speak of something deeper, something Asher couldn't quite place, but something he felt nonetheless. Sahoya didn't step forward, but she didn't step back either. Her gaze never wavered from Asher's, and in that moment, it was as if she had made a decision. She was the one who would follow him, not because she had to, but because she chose to. Asher felt a strange mix of emotions, uncertainty, hesitation, and something else, something he hadn't felt in years, responsibility. He didn't want a companion. He didn't want anyone to rely on him. But in the face of Sahoya's silent decision, he couldn't ignore what was unfolding before him. I don't need anyone," Asher muttered, his words falling flat. but his eyes never left hers. "I'm just a man who keeps to himself." The chief looked at Asher, then back at his daughter. After a long pause, he nodded slowly, as if finally understanding. "She is strong. She will choose her path. She has chosen you." Asher didn't know how to respond. He didn't want this. But as he turned to leave the camp, he felt the weight of Sahoya's eyes still on him, following him, even as the others watched in silence. It wasn't a choice Asher made. It was a choice Sahoya made. And in that moment, Asher realized that, whether he wanted it or not, his life would never be the same. As they walked back to his horse, Sahoya didn't speak a word. She simply followed him, her face set in a quiet determination. Asher didn't look back, but in his chest he felt the unmistakable pull of something new beginning. He wasn't sure what it was yet, but it was there, growing, shifting in the space between them. The journey back to the cabin would be long, the silence thick between them. But in that silence, Asher felt a stirring, something he hadn't felt in years, a connection. And though he couldn't bring himself to admit it, he knew that, no matter what happened next, his solitary life would soon be a thing of the past. The cold winds of winter had a way of biting deeper out in the valley, where the land stretched out flat and endless, just like the time that seemed to pass so slow. Asher Boone had always felt at home in the stillness of the wilderness, his ranch being little more than a patch of land that didn't ask for much. Just a roof, a few walls, and the endless work of raising cattle and managing the crops that barely survived the harsh seasons. But now, with Sahoya following him back to the ranch, that stillness was about to shift in ways Asher wasn't ready for. He hadn't asked for her to come along, but she had chosen to follow him, an offer, or maybe more of a decision, she had made on her own. His cabin was simple, no comforts beyond the bare essentials. A stone fireplace, a worn table, a single bed tucked against the wall. The floorboards creaked with every step, and the smell of damp wood and earthy soil filled the air. It wasn't much to look at, but to Asher, it was everything. It was his life. It was his peace. He didn't want it to change. He had spent years carving out a life here, in this place where he could be left alone with his thoughts, his work, and the land that had given him both the freedom and the solitude to escape the past. But when Sahoya stepped into his world, she brought something with her, a presence that Asher didn't know how to deal with. For the first few days, Asher kept his distance. He let her settle into the corner of the cabin with the few belongings she had, blankets, a small bundle of clothes, and a bundle of herbs she had wrapped tightly to her chest. It was a quiet existence, one that was familiar to Asher, but something had shifted in the air. He wasn't alone anymore, and the truth of that hung heavily between them, unspoken. Asher had always believed that silence was where a man found his peace. The rhythm of the day was simple: tend to the cattle, fix the fences, chop the firewood, mend the roof before the next snowstorm hit. It was a life that had kept him busy and, in its way, distracted him from the darker corners of his mind. But Sahoya wasn't like the people Asher had known. She didn't stay still. She didn't sit quietly by the fire, staring out into the night. No, she was too active for that. She moved around the cabin, folding blankets, sweeping the floor, organizing the little bits of food Asher kept in the cupboard. Her hands, though rough from the harsh life she had lived, seemed to bring a kind of order to his space. It was strange seeing her in his home, watching her tend to the small things that, to him, had never mattered. He had grown used to the silence, to the routine, but she brought a new kind of energy, one he couldn't quite place. Her presence was there, hovering between them like a quiet whisper, always there but never intruding. She worked quietly. She never spoke much, but her eyes were always watching him. Asher didn't mind that. It was as if she was learning the rhythm of the land just as he had, the rhythm of survival. She helped when he needed it, feeding the chickens, gathering the eggs, checking the traps for small game, and sometimes even mending a piece of clothing when it was torn. Asher didn't ask her to do any of this, but in the quiet moments, when the sun hung low in the sky and the wind howled in the distance, he could feel something shifting. The work wasn't just about survival anymore. It wasn't just about getting through another day. For the first time in years, Asher found himself thinking beyond the present moment. He thought about the future, a future that didn't feel so solitary. They didn't talk much, and when they did, it was about small things. "The fire's dying," Sahoya would say, her voice low and soft. Or, "The cattle are grazing near the stream. Need to move them before sundown." Asher didn't need to speak more than necessary. He had never been one for idle chatter. But the silence, though comfortable, began to feel different now. Sahoya's quiet presence made him realize just how much he had lived without over the years. She was a reminder that people could matter, not just as company, but as part of the world he had built for himself. Each morning they worked side by side with no real conversation, but something deeper began to pass between them, a kind of unspoken understanding. He didn't need to tell her what needed doing, and she didn't ask questions about the things he didn't say. She just moved through the day as if she belonged, her presence as steady as the sun rising over the hills. There were moments, though, when Sahoya would look at him with those steady eyes of hers, and Asher would feel something stir in him, something old and buried. He would quickly look away, focusing instead on the task at hand. But it was hard to ignore the feeling that was growing in his chest. It was an ache, slow and steady, like the pull of the earth itself, calling him to something he wasn't ready to face. He began to notice the way Sahoya moved, how her hands worked quickly and precisely, how she would fix something in the cabin without being asked. He watched the way she tended to the cattle, how she would coax a stubborn cow to follow with just a soft word and a steady hand. She wasn't afraid of hard work, and though he hadn't realized it before, neither was he. For the first time in years, Asher felt a sense of partnership, not the kind that came from obligation or convenience, but something deeper, something rooted in the land and the work they shared. Over the course of those first few weeks, Asher came to accept the presence of Sahoya in his life. It wasn't an easy thing for him to admit. He had spent so many years avoiding connection, keeping people at arm's length. But with her, it felt different. She wasn't a stranger. She wasn't someone who came to take something from him. She was someone who simply belonged to the land, to the rhythm of the day, to the quiet that surrounded them. The mornings were still cold, and the wind still howled through the valley. But something about the way Sahoya moved through the world, how she worked, how she existed, had begun to melt the coldness in Asher's heart. He could still hear the echoes of the past, the voice of his brother calling out from the grave, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him. But those moments grew fewer now, replaced by something new, a feeling of being needed. It was subtle, the change that was creeping in. Asher didn't wake up one day to find himself full of hope or joy, but the days began to feel different. He no longer went through them mechanically, surviving without thought. Now there was something more. There was purpose. And with that, Asher realized that he wasn't alone anymore, not just in body, but in spirit. Sahoya had become something more than just a guest in his life. She was a part of it. And though he didn't yet understand what that meant, it was enough to keep him from turning back to the past he had tried so hard to bury. For the first time in a long while, Asher felt something stir inside him, a kind of peace that came from sharing the work, from knowing that no matter what happened, there was someone by his side. It wasn't love, not yet. It wasn't even trust, fully. But it was the beginning of something new, something Asher hadn't expected when he first crossed paths with Sahoya. And that, in itself, was enough to change everything. The sun hung low that afternoon, bleeding a soft amber light over the valley. The snow had begun to thin, leaving patches of hard earth exposed between the drifts. Asher Boone was out near the tree line, checking the traps he'd set the day before. The air was sharp, the kind that bit into your lungs and reminded you that winter wasn't done yet. His boots crunched against the frost, each step echoing louder than it should have in the stillness. He had done this 1,000 times, followed the same trail, checked the same iron traps, listened to the same sounds of the wind whispering through the pines. Routine had always kept him steady, but that afternoon something felt off. The silence wasn't the same. It was heavier. Watching. He crouched near one of the traps and froze. There were tracks in the snow, not animal, not his, human, fresh. The prints were shallow, light, made by someone moving carefully. Whoever it was had been near his traps, maybe even near the cabin. Asher's jaw tightened. He rose slowly, scanning the tree line. The wind carried no sound, but the feeling in his gut was enough. Someone had been here, close enough to watch. He squatted again, brushing his gloved fingers over the prints. They headed west, back toward the ridge. That ridge overlooked his land, his cabin, in the small fenced corral where the cattle fed. Asher's pulse thudded in his chest. He'd seen this before. The signs, the stillness before trouble. And just like that, the past came roaring back. Loud, raw, and merciless. The smell of gunpowder, the screams of his brother, the way Samuel's blood soaked into the dirt of some godforsaken hill during the war. He could still feel the weight of his brother's body in his arms, the last breath leaving him while Asher shouted his name into the smoke and chaos. He had run from that memory for years, buried it under layers of work, solitude, and silence. But the snow couldn't hide those prints any more than Asher could hide his ghosts. He stood there for a long moment, staring into the fading light, until the sound of footsteps behind him broke his trance. He turned sharply, his hand moving to the rifle slung over his shoulder. It was Sahoya, bundled in a coat that hung loose over her shoulders, her dark hair braided against the wind. She didn't speak right away. She didn't need to. One look at his face told her enough. "There are tracks," he said, voice low. "Someone's been here." She moved closer, her eyes scanning the snow, reading the signs like she had been born to it. "They watched," she said quietly. "Not come close, just watched." Asher nodded. "That's what I'm afraid of." That night, the wind howled through the valley, shaking the shutters and whispering against the roof. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low, its light throwing soft orange shadows against the wooden walls. Asher sat at the table, oiling his rifle, his movements slow and deliberate. He wasn't just cleaning a gun, he was calming his mind, preparing himself for something he didn't yet understand. Sahoya sat near the fire, mending one of his shirts. The sound of her needle sliding through the fabric was the only thing keeping the room from falling into silence. "You think it's raiders?" she asked without looking up. "Could be," Asher replied. "Could be someone passing through. But no one passes through this valley by accident." He looked toward the window again, eyes narrowing. "They might have seen the smoke from the chimney. Might have seen us." Sahoya nodded slowly, setting the shirt aside. "You fought before?" she said softly, not as a question but as a fact. "You know this feeling?" Asher's jaw flexed. "Yeah," he muttered. "Too damn well." For a while, neither spoke. The fire crackled, the wind pressed against the cabin walls, and the memories pressed harder. Every flicker of flame brought back flashes, his brother's face, the smell of blood, the sound of a single gunshot that had ended everything. He could still hear Samuel's voice, young, full of that wild confidence he'd always carried. "You can't protect everyone, Ash. Sometimes you just gotta ride it out." The memory struck him like a hammer. Asher clenched his jaw, forcing it away. But memories don't stay buried forever. They just wait until you're quiet enough to hear them again. Sahoya stood and crossed the small space between them, laying a hand gently on his arm. "The war is not here," she said quietly. "Not now." Her voice was steady, strong, in a way that anchored him. She didn't say it to comfort him. She said it like a truth, and Asher, for a moment, believed her. But deep down, he knew better. War never really leaves a man. It just changes its shape. The next morning, the valley was quiet again. Too quiet. A thin fog hung over the land, blurring the edges of the trees and the river. Asher stepped outside before dawn, his rifle slung across his shoulder, scanning the horizon. No movement, no sound but the steady rush of the river beneath the ice. Still, he felt it, the unease, the sense that something was out there, watching from the trees. He walked the perimeter of the ranch, boots sinking into the slush where the snow had begun to melt. Every fence post, every track, every shadow felt like something waiting to happen. He wasn't just looking for danger now, he was anticipating it. By the time he returned to the cabin, the sun had started to rise. Sahoya was already awake, tending to the fire, the smell of coffee and corn mash filling the air. She looked up at him, reading his face like she always did. Nothing? She asked. Nothing yet, he said. But that doesn't mean safe. She didn't flinch at his words. She just nodded, as if danger was an old acquaintance she'd already met before. And maybe it was. Asher sat by the door, tightening the straps on his holster. His movements were mechanical, practiced. He wasn't just preparing for an attack. He was preparing for what the land might demand of him next. In his mind, he saw every possible scenario. Raiders coming through the ridge, thieves looking for easy prey, or worse, men from his past, men who might still carry grudges from the war. He looked up and found Sahoya watching him. Her eyes were calm but searching. "You think they come for you?" she asked quietly. Asher didn't answer right away. The truth was, he didn't know. But a part of him feared it, because deep down he'd always believed that trouble was something you could outrun only for so long before it caught up again. "Maybe," he said finally, "but if they do, they'll find I'm not the same man I was back then." As the day stretched on, Asher found himself pacing near the edge of the cabin, every sense tuned to the land around him. The ghosts of his past weren't content to stay quiet anymore. They whispered in the crunch of the snow, in the creak of the barn door, in the stillness between breaths. He could see Samuel in his mind again, laughing, alive, young, and then gone. That was the hardest part of memory, the way it could trick you into believing for a second that the dead were still within reach. When night came, Asher sat on the porch, his rifle resting across his knees, the stars cutting through the sky like shards of glass. Sahoya joined him after a while, sitting beside him in silence. They didn't speak because there was nothing to say. Out here, words didn't mean much. The land spoke louder. Finally, after a long while, Asher said quietly, "If someone comes for this place, for us, I'll be ready." Sahoya looked at him, her eyes catching the firelight from inside the cabin. "You not fight alone," she said simply. He nodded once, but the words hit deeper than she probably knew. For years, he'd lived by one rule: don't let anyone close enough to need you, or worse, for you to need them. But now, sitting beside this woman who had walked into his life uninvited and stayed without asking permission, Asher realized that maybe needing someone wasn't the same as weakness. Maybe it was the only thing keeping him standing. That night, long after Sahoya had gone to sleep, Asher stayed awake, staring into the fire. Outside, the valley was silent, but inside, his thoughts roared. The ghosts of the past had returned, but this time, he wasn't facing them alone. And for the first time since the war, he wasn't afraid. Spring had finally come to the valley, though the land was still shaking off winter's grip. Patches of green were beginning to show through the muddy snowmelt, and the river that had once been a frozen vein of silence now rushed with new life. The air smelled different, warmer, alive, full of the promise that maybe things could start again. Asher Boone stood by the corral, hammering a new plank onto the fence. The cattle moved lazily nearby, their breath rising in faint clouds under the morning sun. He'd always liked this time of year, the renewal, the quiet rhythm of work. But this spring felt different. It wasn't just the thaw, it was something in the air between him and Sahoya. She was kneeling by the garden bed near the cabin, turning the soil with her hands. A small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth as she worked. Asher caught himself watching her longer than he meant to, then turned back to his hammering, muttering under his breath. Peace. That was what this place had given him. But in the back of his mind, Asher had learned one thing from life out here. Peace never lasted long. He was right. By mid-afternoon, a shadow broke the horizon, a small figure on horseback, riding fast along the ridge. Asher shaded his eyes, squinting against the glare. The rider was small, barely more than a boy, his long hair whipping in the wind. He rode with the kind of urgency that made Asher's gut twist. As the rider drew closer, Sahoya looked up, her face tightening. She recognized the markings on the boy's clothing before Asher did. "Apache," she murmured, standing slowly. The boy dismounted before the horse had even stopped, his chest heaving with effort. He looked barely 14, but his eyes carried the same weight Asher had seen in grown men who'd seen too much. He spoke first to Sahoya, in the soft rhythm of his people's tongue. His voice was trembling, his words spilling out too quickly. Sahoya listened in silence, her face shifting. Confusion, disbelief, and then a spark of something Asher hadn't seen in her for a long time. Hope. Finally, she turned toward Asher, her voice shaking. "My sister," she said. "She's alive." Asher froze, the hammer still in his hand. The boy looked at him now, switching to broken English. "Your woman's sister," he said carefully. "She hide with small camp near the canyon south of White Mesa. Raiders. They burned the others, but she run, she live." For a moment the world seemed to still. The only sound was the wind cutting through the grass, the creak of the corral gate swinging open. Sahoya's hands covered her mouth. She was trembling, not from fear, but from something deeper. Relief. After all this time, the weight she'd been carrying, the loss she'd accepted as final, it wasn't final at all. Asher took a slow breath. "You're sure?" he asked. The boy nodded. "I saw her. She sent me. She say her name, Nadia." Sahoya's knees nearly gave out. She leaned against the fence, her eyes brimming. For the first time since he'd known her, Asher saw tears fall freely down her face. Not tears of grief, but of something gentler, something long overdue. That night, the cabin was alive with quiet motion. Sahoya moved like a woman reborn, gathering supplies, wrapping blankets, whispering prayers in her native tongue. The fire crackled in the hearth, throwing golden light over her determined face. Asher sat at the table watching her. He hadn't seen this kind of light in her eyes before. For months, she had lived with a quiet strength, her spirit tempered by survival. But now there was something fierce burning inside her again. A purpose. "You really think she's out there?" he said finally. Sahoya turned to him, her eyes steady. "I know she is. My sister. She was younger, but strong. Always strong. I thought she'd gone, but now..." Her voice broke slightly, then steadied again. "Now I go." Asher leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw. "You know what's out there. White Mesa's not safe country. Raiders run that stretch. The army don't go near it. It's rough land, even for folks who know it." "Ah," she didn't flinch. "I go anyway." He looked at her for a long time. Her determination reminded him of something, maybe of himself once, before he'd learned to live with giving up. He'd told himself he was done fighting for things that could be taken away. But now, watching her, he felt that quiet ache again. The one that told him maybe he wasn't finished after all. He sighed and stood. "Then you won't be going alone." Sahoya froze, turning to him slowly. "You would come?" Asher met her gaze. "Someone's got to watch your back. That country isn't forgiving." He paused, his voice low. "Besides, this place owes you something. So do I." For a long moment, she just stared at him. Then, for the first time since she had come to his cabin, she smiled. It wasn't a big smile, just a small, quiet curve of her lips. But it carried more weight than any words could. They spent the next day preparing. Asher packed his saddlebag with rations, jerked meat, coffee grounds, dried beans, cartridges for his rifle. Sahoya packed herbs, bandages, and a small pouch of keepsakes. The horses were restless, their hooves thudding against the earth, sensing the journey ahead. Asher checked the rifle one last time, slinging it over his shoulder. The sun was setting when they stood at the edge of the property, the wind carrying the smell of thawing pine and earth. The land stretched endlessly before them, dangerous, vast, and uncertain. But for the first time in a long while, Asher didn't feel that old emptiness pressing in on him. Instead, there was something else. Purpose. He turned to Sahoya. "You sure about this?" She nodded, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "I find her, no matter what waits." Asher smiled faintly. "Then let's ride." They rode out at dawn, the cold mist still clinging to the valley. The trail wound through ridges and streams swollen with melted snow. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and blooming sagebrush. Sahoya rode ahead sometimes, her eyes sharp, scanning the distance. Asher followed, watching the way she moved, steady, sure, unafraid. It struck him then how far she'd come from the frightened woman he'd met that winter. She wasn't someone who needed saving anymore. She was someone who had given him a reason to live again. As the miles fell away behind them, Asher felt something shift deep inside. For so long, his life had been about survival. getting through each day, keeping his head down, avoiding pain. But now with Sahoya beside him and the open land stretching endlessly ahead, he realized that maybe life wasn't just about surviving. Maybe it was about finding something or someone worth the risk. That thought scared him more than any outlaw or ghost from his past ever could. But it also made him feel alive in a way he hadn't in years. That night, they made camp near the river. The sky above them was endless, filled with 1,000 stars that burned cold and bright. Asher sat by the fire, his hat pulled low, while Sahoya tended to the horses. When she returned, she sat beside him in silence, watching the flames. After a while, she spoke softly. "When I find her, maybe we build something new. Not like before. Different, but free." Asher poked the fire with a stick, the sparks rising into the night air. "Sounds like a good plan." She looked at him, her voice barely a whisper. "You believe we make it?" He smiled faintly, his eyes still on the fire. "I've seen worse odds." For a while they said nothing more. The river whispered beside them, and the wind carried the scent of spring. They were two people shaped by loss, bound by something neither of them had planned. But under the stars there was a quiet understanding. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The land had changed with the season, but not enough to make the journey easy. The snow that had blanketed the ground only weeks ago had melted into mud and rivers that overflowed their banks, making every mile harder than the last. The air smelled of pine sap and thawing earth, signs of life returning, even in a place that still felt half dead. Asher, Boone, and Sahoya rode side by side through the thinning forest, their horses moving slow and steady across the uneven trail. The world around them was quiet except for the rhythm of hooves against the damp ground and the creak of worn leather. They'd been traveling for days now, following the boys' directions south toward White Mesa, a stretch of land few men dared to cross. The hills there were scarred with old canyons and broken trails, the kind of country that could swallow a person whole if they didn't know where they were going. But Sahoya did. She rode ahead most mornings, scanning the terrain, reading the signs of the earth the way Asher read the movement of cattle. He trusted her instincts, and she trusted his steadiness, an unspoken bond that had only grown stronger with every mile. The journey wasn't just about finding her sister, not anymore. For both of them, it had become something else entirely, a test of who they were now, after everything they had lost. The land had changed with the season, but not enough to make the journey easy. The snow that had blanketed the ground only weeks ago had melted into mud and rivers that overflowed their banks, making every mile harder than the last. The air smelled of pine sap and thawing earth, signs of life returning, even in a place that still felt half dead. Asher, Boone, and Sahoya rode side by side through the thinning forest, their horses moving slow and steady across the uneven trail. The world around them was quiet except for the rhythm of hooves against the damp ground and the creak of worn leather. They'd been traveling for days now, following the boys' directions south toward White Mesa, a stretch of land few men dared to cross. The hills there were scarred with old canyons and broken trails, the kind of country that could swallow a person whole if they didn't know where they were going. But Sahoya did. She rode ahead most mornings, scanning the terrain, reading the signs of the earth the way Asher read the movement of cattle. He trusted her instincts, and she trusted his steadiness, an unspoken bond that had only grown stronger with every mile. The journey wasn't just about finding her sister, not anymore. For both of them, it had become something else entirely, a test of who they were now after everything they had lost. On the third day, the rain came. It started as a drizzle at dawn and turned into a downpour by midday. The sky went from gray to near black, and the sound of thunder rolled through the mountains like a warning. The trail became a slick mess of mud and rock, and every step forward was a battle against the elements. Asher gritted his teeth and pulled his hat lower against the rain. His coat was soaked through, his boots caked in mud. He glanced over at Sahoya, who rode with her back straight, her eyes fixed ahead. She didn't complain, didn't flinch. They found shelter that night under an overhang of stone, the rain still pounding outside as they built a small fire from the driest twigs they could find. The fire sputtered but caught, glowing weakly in the dark. Sahoya sat close to the flames, her blanket drawn tight around her shoulders. Water dripped from her hair, catching the light like shards of glass. Asher sat across from her, rubbing warmth back into his hands. "You've got grit," he said quietly, breaking the silence. "Most folks would have turned back 2 days ago." She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "I've seen worse storms," she said softly. Then after a moment she added, "You too?" Asher chuckled under his breath. "Yeah, guess I have." For a while they sat without speaking, the fire popping softly between them. The rain had softened to a steady drizzle, and the smell of wet earth filled the cave. In the flicker of the firelight, Sahoya's eyes looked distant, somewhere far away, somewhere that wasn't this cave. He didn't ask what she was thinking. He already knew. She was thinking of her sister. And for reasons he didn't want to admit, Asher found himself wanting her to find that peace, wanting it more than he wanted to keep his own walls standing. By the time the storm passed, the world had turned sharp and clean again. The sky was blue, the air crisp. They rode out early, their horses refreshed and restless from the long night. The trail wound through a canyon lined with red rock and patches of stubborn snow that refused to melt. The river below snaked through the valley, reflecting the morning light. It was the kind of land that could steal a man's breath, and then his life if he wasn't careful. By midday, they saw movement on the ridge above them. Asher reined in his horse, narrowing his eyes. 3 figures on horseback, maybe more, were silhouetted against the skyline. He couldn't see their faces, but he didn't need to. The way they sat their saddles, the way their horses shifted restlessly, it wasn't friendly. "Don't look," he murmured to Sahoya. "Keep riding." She didn't ask questions. She followed his lead, her posture stiffening slightly. They rode on for another mile before the ridge opened up and the figures disappeared from view. But Asher's gut told him it wasn't over. Trouble had a way of circling back, especially in places like this. That night, when they made camp, he kept the fire low and his rifle close. Sahoya said nothing, but she didn't sleep either. The silence between them was tense, filled with the kind of knowing that didn't need words. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and though Asher had heard that sound 1,000 times before, it made the back of his neck prickle. They moved faster after that, rising before dawn, breaking camp before the light touched the horizon. The land grew rougher, the trails narrower. They crossed icy streams, climbed steep ridges, and rode through forests that seemed to whisper of eyes watching from the dark. On the 5th day, they came to a river that was too deep to cross easily. The bridge, a rickety span of rotted wood, had long since fallen. The current below churned, fast and cold. Sahoya dismounted, scanning the banks. "We cross here," she said. Asher looked at her like she was crazy. "You trying to drown us both?" She smiled faintly, a rare thing these days. "Not if we move fast." They tied down their packs and guided the horses into the water. The current bit at their legs, pulling hard, but they pushed through together. Halfway across, Sahoya's horse stumbled, losing its footing. "Asher!" she cried out. He didn't think. He moved. In 2 strides, he was beside her, one arm wrapping around her waist, his other hand gripping the reins tight. The water surged around them, icy and relentless, but he pulled them both through. When they finally made it to the other side, soaked to the bone, Sahoya fell to her knees, laughing breathlessly. "You're out of your damn mind," Asher said, shaking his head, water dripping from his hat brim. "Maybe," she said between breaths, "but I'm still here." Asher couldn't help it. He laughed too. It was the first real laugh he'd had in years, deep and raw, cutting through the cold. And in that moment, something broke loose inside him. The wall he'd built around himself, the guilt he'd carried for too long. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and realized that somewhere along this trail, she'd become more than just someone he was helping. She'd become the thing that kept him going. The days passed, and the land began to shift again. The forest thinned into open plains, and the air grew warmer. They were close now, Sahoya could feel it. Each night she prayed softly by the fire, whispering her sister's name to the stars. Asher never interrupted. He just sat nearby, cleaning his rifle or watching the flames, pretending not to listen, but taking in every word. The journey had carved something out of both of them, stripped away everything unnecessary until only the truth remained. They were two souls bound by loss, by hope, by the shared burden of the trail. And as the horizon stretched before them, Asher knew this journey wasn't just about finding her sister. It was about finding themselves, finding something worth fighting for again. Asher looked over at Sahoya as she tended the fire, her face glowing in the light. "You think she's out there?" he asked quietly. Sahoya looked up, her eyes steady. "I know she is." Asher nodded slowly, staring out into the darkness beyond the camp. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying the faintest scent of rain and wild sage. "Then we'll find her," he said, "no matter what waits ahead." And with that, they sat in silence, side by side, the fire between them burning steady against the vast, wild night, two weary travelers chasing the same fragile hope through the heart of the frontier. The last stretch of their journey was the hardest, not because of the land. It had finally softened into open country where the grass bent easy in the wind, but because of what it meant. Hope is a heavy thing to carry when you've been living without it for so long. For weeks, Asher, Boone, and Sahoya had followed faint signs: tracks, campfire remains, scraps of woven cloth caught on brush. Each clue led them deeper into the wild, through canyons and across the plains, until finally, one dusk, they saw smoke curling from a small valley below. Sahoya reined in her horse and stared down at the campfire, her breath catching. "That's her," she whispered, her voice trembling. Asher didn't ask how she knew. He could hear it in her tone. Some truths didn't need words. They approached slowly, their horses moving carefully down the slope. The air was thick with the scent of sagebrush and wood smoke. A figure appeared from the shadows of a tent. A young woman, thin but standing tall, her hair braided like Sahoya's. She froze at the sight of them, her hand hovering near a knife at her hip. Then in a single heartbeat, the recognition broke through. "Nadia!" Sahoya cried, her voice raw. The younger woman's knife fell to the ground. She ran forward, her bare feet kicking up dust, and the two sisters collided in an embrace that felt like it might never end. Sahoya sobbed into her sister's shoulder, clutching her as if afraid she'd vanish again. Asher turned away, giving them the space they needed. He dismounted, tending to the horses, pretending not to hear the muffled cries behind him. But in truth, the sound stirred something deep inside him, something he'd buried for years. He thought of his own brother, Samuel, the one he couldn't save. For a long time, he'd believed reunions like this only belonged to other people, not men like him. But watching those two women, alive and whole again, he realized maybe some wounds could heal after all. The sisters insisted Asher stay the night in the small camp, and he agreed, though he didn't rest much. When dawn came, they broke camp and began the long ride back north, toward the valley where it had all begun. Weeks later, they crested the final ridge, and the sight of the ranch below took Asher's breath. It wasn't much: a patch of grassland, a few grazing cattle, a cabin and barn standing side by side. But it was theirs. For the first time, it looked like more than just a place to live. It looked like home. Asher helped Nadia down from her horse. She was still weak from months on the run, her body thin but her spirit sharp. She looked around the valley, smiling faintly. "You live here?" she asked, her English hesitant but clear. "Yeah," Asher said. "We do." She turned to her sister, something soft in her eyes. "It's good," she said. "Safe." Sahoya nodded, her gaze sweeping over the land. She hadn't realized until now how much this place had changed her, how much they had changed it. When she first arrived, it had been nothing but wood, dirt, and silence. Now there was warmth. Smoke from the chimney curled into the sky. The corral fence stood strong, and the land around it seemed to breathe again. That evening, they cooked a simple meal over the fire: beans, venison, and cornbread. Nadia laughed for the first time in a long while, the sound carrying through the valley. Sahoya sat beside her, their shoulders touching, her smile full and easy. Asher watched them from across the table, his cup of coffee warming his hands. He'd never been good at joining moments like this: family, laughter, peace. But he didn't need to speak to feel part of it. The silence that had once been heavy now felt different, comfortable, alive. When the night settled in and the fire dimmed, Sahoya turned to him. "Tomorrow," she said softly, We build more. Fences, maybe a second cabin. Nadia will stay. Asher nodded, a small smile tugging at his mouth. Yeah, we'll build more. And in that moment, something clicked inside him. It wasn't just about fixing fences or feeding cattle anymore. It was about building something that lasted, something that mattered. In the days that followed, the rhythm of life returned, but it was a new rhythm, fuller than before. The mornings began with the smell of coffee and laughter from inside the cabin. Nadia helped Sahoya plant new crops by the stream, while Asher repaired the barn roof. Every sound that used to echo in loneliness was now filled with life. The soft clatter of dishes, the rhythmic thud of a hammer, the voices of two sisters talking in a language older than the land itself. Sometimes Asher would pause in his work, leaning against the fence post to watch them. It wasn't out of longing, it was out of quiet gratitude. For the first time since Samuel's death, he didn't feel like a man waiting for the past to catch him. He felt free. One afternoon, as the sun began to set behind the mountains, Sahoya joined him by the corral. Her hair was loose, the wind tugging at it. She leaned against the fence beside him, watching the light fade. "You ever think," she said softly, "that we were meant to find each other?" Asher's lips twitched. "I don't know about meant to, but I'm glad we did." She smiled, eyes on the horizon. "You were alone too long," she said. "Now you not." He looked at her then, really looked, and saw in her eyes the same kind of freedom he felt inside. She hadn't been given to him, like the old ways dictated. She had chosen to stay, and somehow that made all the difference. By midsummer, the ranch had changed completely. The garden was thick with green shoots, the fences strong and straight, the fields alive with cattle. Nadia had built a small shelter near the stream, her laughter a constant melody around the place. And every evening, when the day's work was done, Asher, Sahoya, and Nadia would sit together by the porch as the sky turned gold and pink, watching the land settle into night. The valley, once quiet and cold, was alive again. The air carried the scent of fresh-cut hay, and the soft hum of cicadas filled the space where loneliness used to live. Asher often found himself thinking about freedom, what it really meant. He'd spent years believing it was solitude, distance, and silence. But now, watching the two women beside him, he understood something deeper. Freedom wasn't about being alone. It was about having the right to choose who stood beside you. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Hard seasons, storms, maybe even loss again. But for the first time, the thought didn't scare him. He'd faced the worst the world could offer and still found his way home. As the last light of sunset faded from the valley, Sahoya leaned her head against his shoulder. "We live here now," she whispered. "Together?" Asher nodded, his arm resting lightly around her. "Yeah," he said softly. "Together." The wind moved through the grass that night, soft and warm. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled low, casting golden light over the walls. The three of them sat quietly, the peace between them unbroken, the weight of their past finally at rest. For Asher Boone, the man who once believed the world had nothing left to offer, it turned out that life had been waiting all along, waiting for him to stop running, to turn and face it, and to build something real. And for Sahoya, the woman who had once been given away as payment for a debt, she had found something greater than freedom. She had found choice. They lived together, not out of obligation, not out of survival, but out of love, trust, and the kind of quiet peace that only comes after a storm. And that, more than anything, was true freedom.